A MOL quer contribuir com a justiça nesse momento tão difícil. É a hora de buscarmos diálogo, união, soluções conjuntas. É a hora de celebrarmos acordos. Estamos disponibilizando gratuitamente nossa plataforma a todos os órgãos do Poder Judiciário durante a pandemia da Covid-19, para que as conciliações e mediações no Brasil não parem. MOL, online, humana, brasileira.
Bom, boa noite a todos, bem-vindos a mais um webinar da Casa JOTA Online. Este é um evento especial de estreia da nova série que o Jota promove a partir desta semana para discutir os desafios da democracia brasileira e o papel do judiciário na defesa da Constituição. O projeto se chama Democracia e Constituição, Voz e Letra, baseado em um discurso histórico de Ulisses Guimarães. Neste ciclo, vamos ouvir atores dos três poderes, da academia e da sociedade civil, para aprofundar o debate tão importante para a previsibilidade institucional do país, missão primordial do Jota. O nosso convidado de hoje é o professor Levitsky, da Escola de Governo de Harvard, e autor do best-seller Como as Democracias Morrem. Para quem acompanha os eventos pelo YouTube, se inscreva no nosso canal do Jota e ative as notificações naquele sino para saber dos próximos debates. Assinantes Jota Pro e convidados podem fazer as perguntas pelo chat do Zoom. No Zoom também é possível escolher hoje a opção para ouvir a tradução simultânea. Basta clicar ali do lado, ali embaixo, na opção Interpretation e Interpretação e escolher português. No YouTube, a tradução já estará disponível automaticamente. Agora vou começar a nossa conversa em inglês. Professor Levitsky, thank you so much for your time to talk with us. We really appreciate. Let's start with a more general question.
Vou começar com uma pergunta mais genérica.
What signs should an observer pay attention to that might explain when democracies die?
Quando as democracias morrem. Bom, as democracias morrem quando alguém estamos tendo um pequeno problema técnico.
When the major political forces begin to view one another, or cast one another, not as rivals, not as competitors, but
não como rivais, não como concorrentes, mas sim como ameaças existenciais. Pode ser um sinal de que a democracia morre. Ao contrário do passado, as democracias costumam morrer nas mãos não num golpe.
It's much more likely to happen in a much more subtle way through the election of autocratic figures, autocratic prime ministers or presidents. And so it's also really important, particularly in a polarized context, to make sure that citizens and political leaders ensure that they're only nominating and electing figures.
Só estão indicando
because Donald Trump was demonstrably not committed to democratic rules of the game, and the Brazilians made in 2018 because Jair Bolsonaro was also very clearly not committed to democratic rules of the game.
And we go back to that famous definition that it's the only game in town, right? You need to think that it's the only game in town. Let me think about...
Deixa eu pensar um pouco em outra parte disso. O Jota nasceu para observar o sistema jurídico, né? Por isso que a gente tem o Jota. Já escreveu 2 livros sobre esse assunto.
Okay. It is very common to go after the courts. In fact,
é muito comum que isso aconteça. Na verdade, a primeira regra de um autocrata eleito
do two things. If an elected autocrat controls them, they can use the law enforcement agencies and the courts as shields against investigation.
Ele usa isso como um escudo contra a interpretação para que ele possa participar, ter um comportamento ilegal com impunidade, por um lado, e por outro lado, se a gente capturar, é possível usar
Turkey or Hungary or Poland or the Philippines have to at least pretend that they're abiding by the rule of law. And so if you can
eles estão pelo menos fingindo que eles respeitam o Estado de Direito, não colocando na cadeia como oposição, mas sim por corrupção, por fraude ou por qualquer outro tipo de falha.
In almost every case I can think of, including the United States, elected autocrats or potential elected autocrats, really their first move is to go after the courts. We saw it in Hungary, saw it in Turkey, saw it in Venezuela.
Eu vi isso acontecer na Hungria, na Venezuela, no Equador, na Nicarágua. E o Donald Trump está tentando fazer isso também.
Is it always the same move or we have variation there?
Será que é a mesma coisa sempre ou a gente tem variações?
The Supreme Court.
No, it's different. It varies depending on the type of system, whether it's a presidential or parliamentary system. It often varies depending on the strength of the Supreme Court. So in the United States and Brazil, you've got a pretty powerful and independent Supreme Court that's not so easy to pack. So you begin often in other parts of the state. In other places, the Supreme Court is much weaker. In other places, it's easier to say, in some cases, it's easy to pack the court. You can expand the size of the Supreme Court and fill it with allies like Hugo Chavez did. That's harder, at least so far in Brazil and the United States. So the strategies vary depending on the strength of institutions, whether you sort of actually pack the court or whether you kind of bully it or try to bribe it behind the scenes, which is, I think, the case more in some of the stronger democracies.
Então, essa estratégia depende da instituição. Na sua visão, essa crise da Covid que nós estamos enfrentando,
who wants to decrease democratic accountability? I was thinking about Hungary here, but is there a possibility that this crisis might help these leaders that want to decrease?
Isso é uma possibilidade? Sim, é uma possibilidade, mas não é uma certeza.
COVID crisis started, I mean, first of all, crises in general, economic crises, security crises, wars, terrorist attacks, major crises, particularly those in which citizens are really frightened and turn to the state for protection. Those sorts of crises are almost always an opportunity for autocratic-minded governments. And very, very often when you see sort of autocratic seizures of power, it occurs during a crisis. Sometimes it's an invented crisis. Sometimes it's a real crisis. But crises very, very often present an opportunity for leaders to expand their power. And people thought, a lot of people expected that the COVID crisis, the pandemic, would create many such opportunities across the world. We've seen it in a few places. We've seen it very clearly in Hungary. We've seen it in El Salvador, closer to home. A little bit in India and Philippines. But by and large, it hasn't been that widespread. We've not seen that many cases of autocratic leaders seizing power amidst the pandemic. I think one reason for that is that many autocratic leaders, particularly some populist ones, like Bolsonaro and Trump, have been weakened by the crisis. They responded badly, and they've been kind of on the defensive since the crisis. In order to seize power, in order to suspend the Constitution, close Congress, have lead some kind of an autogolpe, you need to be in a relatively strong position, as Hugo Chavez was in the early 2000s, or as Fujimori was in 1992. And the COVID crisis left a number of leaders really on the defensive and weakened. And so they, as a result, were not really able to take advantage of the crisis. I still think that the COVID crisis poses a real threat to democracy in Latin America. I think the greatest threat is probably in the medium term and economic. I think, I'm not an economist, obviously nobody knows exactly how deep and how enduring this economic crisis is going to be, but we're very likely headed toward a pretty serious economic crisis and fiscal crisis in Latin America that could last quite a while. And one thing we know is that prolonged economic crises pose a real challenge to new democracies and to weak democracies. And so I worry a lot that if this is an economic and fiscal crisis that sort of begins to look like the 1980s, or worse, something like Europe in the 1930s, we could see fragile democracies, particularly in the Andes and in Central America, get into real trouble. This really could be the worst period, both economically and politically, for the region since the 80s.
And what is the mechanism there in times of economic crisis of that? Why is that?
The mechanism can be multiple, but when governments fail to deliver the goods, when usually more than one government is unable to deliver economic growth, is perceived. I mean, no matter what the ultimate cause of the crisis, even if it's totally exogenous, like a pandemic, ultimately citizens blame governments when things are going badly. And if multiple governments are perceived to perform poorly, they lose support, and eventually the system begins to lose support. Systems in Latin American democracies already were in pretty shaky ground, even in places where democracy is perceived by political scientists to have worked pretty well, like in Chile and even Brazil. Latin American citizens had pretty mixed views of democratic performance before the crisis, and I think there's a good chance that if the crisis lasts 3, 4, 5 years, those views of democracy are going to decline even more. And so, what does that do? That makes it more likely that you'll have that you'll see the election of anti-system outsiders. And so, the one mechanism is the election of an anti-system outsider like Correa or Chavez or Fujimori, who then buries democracy. Another mechanism is the older mechanism of military intervention, which in some Latin American countries, surveys suggest, would be accepted by a good-sized chunk of the population. So there are many ways to die, but democratic death is much more likely in a context of prolonged crisis than in a context of decent economic performance.
You already talked a little bit about that, but we are seeing also some populist leaders having some challenges, right, in this crisis. Do you think that's partly explained because, for instance, in presidential system, presidents might be more blamed for this type of crisis, economic crisis, or why some populist leaders are facing these challenges during this time also?
Well, as you know, governments have responded in really different ways. Some governments responded very quickly, seem to have responded very effectively, whether it's Germany or New Zealand or South Korea. Other governments responded poorly or slowly. But populists in general seem to have responded pretty badly. And I don't think anybody is certain about why that's the case, but a couple of reasons. I think the primary one is that many populists, certainly this is true of Bolsonaro and Trump, to some extent AMLO in Mexico, are they're anti-elite. They come to power, they make a political living by bashing the elite. And that elite is usually the political elite, but it's also sort of the intellectual elite. It is universities, it is experts, it is expertise. And very often particularly if populists are aligned with evangelical Christians, like in the United States and Brazil, it's anti-science. And so both Bolsonaro and Trump and AMLO to some degree really came to power with a very antagonistic relationship to intellectuals, to experts, and to science. And they promoted the idea, they embraced the idea that they somehow had a sort of wisdom, or popular wisdom that was beyond the reach of science. They kind of knew better than the scientists. They and the people knew better than the scientists. That kind of bullshit does not work with the coronavirus, and it's going to get you into trouble. You can do that you might be able to get away with that during normal political and economic times, but during a pandemic, it's going to get you in trouble. And we saw that very clearly in the case of the United States and in Brazil, and again, to some extent in Mexico. Not all populists responded in this way, but the populist instinct to kind of reject the experts and act as if the leader knows better is not going to work with COVID-19.
And do you think also some presidents, Trump himself and also Bolsonaro, try to enter this shift blame game, right? So the fault of the economic crisis is not mine, is the governors or it's other areas of the government. This seems to be a hard bargain to sell, right? Because normally presidents also are blamed for economic crisis. Is it easy to shift this blame to other political entities like the governors?
It's not easy. In a federal system like Brazil and the United States, a lot of the governing burden is shared between states and the federal government, and some of the responsibility dealing with the pandemic is in fact borne by the state governments, obviously. So politicians always try, in all conditions, to accept as much of the credit for good stuff as they can, and to shift the blame for the bad things as much as they can. So Trump, for example, was taking full credit for a booming economy that he inherited from the Obama administration. But then as soon as things started to go wrong, he started blaming governors. That's the kind of thing most politicians do. At the end of the day, whether it's fair or not, national governments, federal governments tend to get the credit for good macroeconomic performance, whether they deserve it or not, and they tend to get the blame for poor macroeconomic performance, whether they deserve it or not. And that's increasingly true over time. I don't think there's anything in the medium to long run that Trump or Bolsonaro can do to avoid getting a fair amount of blame for tough times.
Professor, going back to another part of the question and about other parts of this discussion, when looking into different measures of democracy around the world, the Polit4 or others, Freedom House, is there any indication of a democratic deconsolidation in the past few years? Can you see a negative trend in democracies around the world?
On this matter, I differ from most experts that you will read or hear. There has been a lot of talk over the last decade or so of a global democratic recession, of an expansion of authoritarianism and of democracies in crisis. There's a certain degree to which that's true, mostly that there is a threat to Western democracy that is much stronger than, say, 20 or 30 years ago. The global balance of power has shifted quite markedly away from Western liberal democracies. Europe has been in crisis. The United States has been in a pretty significant decline and has lost quite a bit of prestige, particularly since 2003. While at the same time, Russia has grown much more self-confident, and China has slowly but surely expanded its power. So the global balance of power, dominated by the liberal West in the 1990s, is now much more multipolar. And so it is, to use a term that you used earlier, the liberal West and liberal democracy are no longer the only game in town. So that's an international environment today that's much, much less favorable to democracy than the 1990s. The 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Europe and the United States were far and away the dominant economic, military, ideological power on earth, and Western institutions seemed to be the only viable alternative, that was an incredibly favorable period for democracy. Those days are over. Those days were over before the pandemic. Those days were over before Trump. So there's a lot to worry about. There's a lot to worry about internationally. That said, the number of democracies in the world has remained pretty stable for the last 15 years. It increased from the 1970s all the way into about 2005. There was a steady global expansion in the number of democracies, the so-called third wave. People got very optimistic. Observers got very optimistic. It seemed like the whole world was becoming democratic. Democracy really seemed to be the only game in town. And then around 2005, the line flattened. And it's been pretty stable since then. There may be one or two fewer democracies today than there were 10 or 12 years ago, but it's basically been a flat line. We have not seen the collapse of a large number of democracies. We've seen the collapse of a small number of democracies. And some of them have gotten a lot of attention, deservedly. Venezuela, Hungary, Thailand. So some relatively important democracies have broken down. They've been very salient, but they've actually been replaced, or not replaced. They've been, in terms of the macro numbers, compensated by democratizations in other places, whether it's Malaysia or Gambia or Tunisia. So then the number of democracies remain relatively stable. There's a lot to worry about. There may be a democratic recession in our future, but so far we've seen, actually, I would say, a surprising resilience of most democracies in the world. Now, there's a lot to, now the last few years give us even more to worry about, right? The fact that the United States is being governed by people who do not give do not care at all about promoting democracy worldwide. The United States has really ceased to be, for better or worse, a model of democracy in the world. Western democracy promotion has almost disappeared relative to what it was 20 years ago. That's a bad sign. And like we said earlier, the COVID crisis and the accompanying resulting economic crisis is also going to challenge democracy. So although I look at the empirics today and see what is essentially a flat line, no major change, we could have a conversation in 5 years in which things look much worse.
Talking about the empirics and the empirics on democracy, when we look at the empirics in terms of economic growth and development, for instance, right? So we are talking about these threats on democracy, and sometimes the financial market goes up in days that this discussion are going over, right? In terms of democracy, economic growth or development, do democracies promote higher economic growth and development, or is this still an open empirical question for the literature?
The literature, I think, tells us that it's still an open question. There's been a ton of research on this with very, very mixed and diverse results. Really, there are important studies that show that democracies generate better economic performance. There are other studies that show worse. I think ultimately it's kind of a wash. That it's I think a fair statement to say that the greatest economic miracles, the most dramatic cases of rapid industrialization have occurred under authoritarian regimes. I think it's also safe to say that some of the worst human catastrophes and economic collapses have also occurred under authoritarian regimes. So there's a lot of variation. Democracies seem less prone to miracles and less prone to things like famine. But when you average things out, the difference in economic performance is not great. What the drivers of economic performance seem to be things other than the political regime, things like state capacity and other variables that an economist could explain to you better than I could. So democracy is really valuable for a lot of things, but not necessarily for growing your economy.
And when we look at the data, as you saw, the variation in non-democracy is huge, right? So the variance goes all over the place, right? So I wanna talk a little bit about The Economist writes in this week's issue that 10 of Bolsonaro's 22 ministers are now military men. So 10 of 22 ministers comes from the military, and 3,000 others military are in the government, in governmental jobs, right? Is it common for democracies to rely so much on the military, or is Brazil an exception these days?
It's not common for, there are a few exceptions. Countries like Israel, which have spent a lot of their history at war and facing existential military threats, very often have a huge number of military leaders going into politics and many military officials in politics. After major wars, you often see kind of an incursion of military figures into politics. We had Eisenhower and others after World War II in the United States. But normally, most democracies, most real, full democracies, consolidated democracies, don't have a high level of military participation in government. It's rare. I mean, Trump brought a bunch of military folks into his government. They didn't last very long because they cared about things like competence and were less likely to be bullied by Trump than some of the other figures he brought in. But no, it's pretty rare. It's pretty rare. Where you often see a lot of military folks is in regimes that are either breaking down or in crisis, like say Chile in the early 1970s, or regimes that are not really fully democratic, that are kind of hybrid civil military regimes like Guatemala and El Salvador in the 1980s, or Pakistan in much of its history. So it's not usually a good sign. I don't know what this means in Brazil, but it's not something that you find most of the time in stable democracies.
And we saw in this past few weeks some important difference between the Brazil and the US, right? In the US, for instance, the military sent some important messages to President Trump. Here, on the other hand, we are seeing important generals who work for the government. They haven't been releasing press release and with certain threats to other institutions, according to some reads of that, right? You are an expert in comparative politics. What can you expect? What does this say about these two countries, right? And does this position of the military in the US in the past few weeks can put any pressure or some kind of pressure into the Brazilian generals?
I can only speculate on that last question. Look, the U.S. military establishment's response to Trump's effort to politicize the military, I think, was very healthy. Trump acts kind of like an old school neo-patrimonial leader. His instincts are kind of like Somoza or Batista or Trujillo, in the sense that he thinks the state is his toy. He thinks that all state agencies should act to further his own personal interests, and so he doesn't think twice about deploying the military for his own political ends. But as you pointed out, luckily, the military establishment pushed back. It's hard to push back in the United States because there's such a tradition of civilian control. So a military official who is pushed by the president to do something that is maybe dubiously constitutional or unethical or damaging to democracy, that military official has to calculate, because they're going to break a norm. They're either going to break a democratic norm by obeying the president, or they're going to break norms of civilian control by standing up to the president. It puts military leaders in a very, very difficult position, which is why you often see former military officials who are more free to speak coming out and kind of slapping the president on the wrist and defending democratic norms. So the response was pretty positive. In Brazil, I mean, you've got a democracy that is still not quite as institutionalized as the United States. You have a military that, despite dramatic changes over the last 40 years, still has a much longer tradition of military intervention in politics than the United States. You have a democracy whose both democracies are in some degree of crisis, but Brazil has really been in a kind of a perfect storm for the last 6 years, and the military is the one institution, unfortunately, for democracy that still has a lot of public support and a lot of legitimacy. So Brazilians really don't trust any of the political parties. They don't trust a lot of the media. They don't trust Congress. They have a little more trust for the court, but not that much. The institution they trust is the military. So that creates a temptation to bring the military in, right? Any politician who can get the support of the military could benefit. So I think it's a more difficult situation in Brazil. I still don't know what to make of these 10 military figures in the government. I mean, it's not clear, at least to me, quite how representative they are of the armed forces as an institution. And I still hope, I think it's mostly hope, that the military figures will act as an institution, act to keep the armed forces out of the government and away from an alliance with Bolsonaro in order to defend the institution. Obviously, some military figures in the government are openly Bolsonarista and have said some very damaging things about democratic institutions. But I don't think we've heard yet the last word from the military hierarchy. And that will be determinative. I could not predict how they'll ultimately behave if the crisis deepens and the military has to make a choice. I have no idea if they're observing what's happening in the United States or not. But there has been a lot of progress over the last 35 or 40 years in establishing civilian control, in separating the military from civilian authorities, in sort of reprofessionalizing the military after 20 years in power. And hopefully that's enough to sort of curb this temptation to step into the political arena. But I don't know, that's just speculation.
Another concern that, well, we read in the news is actually not the use of military itself, but the military police, right? So the police, the local police, that they have certain supporters for Bolsonaro there, and that there is a lot of speculation about that. But in your studies, have you seen this type of use, not of the military itself, but local military police?
Sure. I mean, in many regimes in particular, democracies that kind of descend into something less than democracy, into some sort of hybrid or authoritarian regime, very often it's not so easy to politicize the military. The military is often a relatively effective institution, a relatively independent institution. So an elected leader, an elected populist, very often does not have easy recourse to the military. It's much easier to use paramilitary groups, to use sometimes militias, sometimes paramilitaries, sometimes the police, sometimes local police, and to kind of repress at the margins of the military. In the case of both Trump and Bolsonaro, there's this additional problem that just given the way that the country is polarized, many men with guns, sometimes in the police, sometimes in the private sector, sometimes ambiguously in between. A lot of men with guns are supporters. Men with guns are overrepresented in the government coalition, right? This is a right-wing populist government that is very illiberal, very sort of open in attacking minority rights and really attacking liberal rights and liberal institutions. And they've got a number of men with guns or sort of violent young men who support them. And both Bolsonaro and Trump use violent rhetoric. I don't know much about Bolsonaro's inner workings, but I think Trump doesn't even fully understand the implications of some of the things he says. And my greatest fear, at least in the United States, is not so much that Trump will use the military or that Trump will use the police, because it's hard to do, to actually repress, but that his discourse will incite and motivate people to take up arms and to engage in violence on their own. And in the case of the United States, it would be pretty spontaneous. We've already seen some mini episodes of this. There was a militia in Arizona that shot somebody yesterday at a protest. That sort of thing could happen on a relatively large scale in the United States. And I think it could be much worse in Brazil, because Brazil's got this big gray area in between the sort of private citizens and the state coercive apparatus, and that is these militias. And a number of these militias have pretty close ties. They're really part of the Bolsonarista coalition. And so it wouldn't be that hard for Bolsonaro or allies of Bolsonaro to mobilize really organized violence in a way that I think goes way beyond the United States. So I worry more about informal violence than actual state violence.
In that sense, I'm not sure if you saw the whole video of that meeting, Bolsonaro and all his ministers. How did you react to the specific part where the president said that he wanted to arm the population to avoid a dictator, and we've seen some changes in controls to guns here in Brazil? How did you react to that?
When you see a president talking about arming the population, in effect, in defense of his government, that is often a prelude to crisis. That very often does not end well. I don't want to exaggerate too much, but that's the sort of discussion that you saw in Chile in the early 70s, in Brazil in the early 60s, in Spain in the mid 1930s. That usually does not end well.
And I wanted to take, follow this path. And we received a question here from Victor. He is talking about a week ago, Professor Shaibub and Professor Chervosky, they presenting a study showing that, I haven't seen the study, but Victor brings to us, most democratic countries took a longer time to react and to start preventive measures than non-democratic countries. And that may result in a higher impact on social and economic recovery. And he's asking if, do you think, and you hindered this question when you talked about China influence, but if you think that China's examples might affect democracies all over the world, the China example on the response to COVID and economic crisis, for instance.
You mean that Shaibub and Jaworski found that democracies were slower to respond to the pandemic? Yeah.
I haven't seen this study also, but Victor brought this to us here.
I mean, that may be true. I guess, it's certainly possible. China is on many dimensions, a very successful regime, right? It's achieved extraordinary rates of economic growth. And ultimately, although we can't be entirely sure of all the figures that are coming out of China, ultimately, it seems to have responded quite successfully to COVID-19 as well. So yeah, China will always be a model, at least a model for other elites who who may seek to sort of construct a non-democratic regime. But a couple of things. First of all, even if democracies responded more slowly to the pandemic, if 3 months in or 4 months in, or I guess 5 months in, we now see that a number of democracies actually responded quite well to the pandemic, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, or South Korea and Taiwan, or most of Western Europe. With the exception of Sweden, almost all of Western Europe. Now, obviously, Italy and Spain got off to a terrible start, but the region has dramatically brought down the number of COVID cases. Germany did quite well. Denmark did quite well. Austria did quite well. So it's not like, now the United States and Brazil are two glaring examples of democracies that responded extraordinarily poorly and are still responding terribly. But most established democracies actually responded pretty well. That's for one. The other thing is, particularly if there isn't a great perceived difference in performance across regimes, as unpopular or as dissatisfied as citizens are, say in Latin America, with their democracies, there is very little evidence of support for a China model politically. I cannot think of a single protest in Latin America in which people were calling for the China model. There have been other periods of history, whether it's the 30s or the 60s and 70s, where other models, whether it's fascist and corporatist models or social, Cuban-style socialism, were popular among important organized groups. But today, nobody in Latin America is calling for single-party rule. Nobody in Latin America wants a system in which they can no longer elect their leaders. So people are dissatisfied with democratic institutions. They don't like their parties. They're dissatisfied with their governments. They don't trust their politicians. They may elect populists who threaten and even undermine democratic institutions, like the horrible situation in Venezuela. But Latin Americans really, to a country, overwhelmingly support competitive electoral rule. They support maintaining a system where they can vote against the goddamn government if they want to. And that's true in much of the world. I know other regions of the world much less well than Latin America. But so at the mass level, at the societal level, at the level even of organized actors, I don't see movement. I don't see the China model emerging as yet as a particularly viable alternative.
We also receive another question here asking, how do you see the role of international instance, like international systems or systems of protection of human rights, international courts, in the contention of democratic threats?
I personally am skeptical of the power of international and multilateral institutions. Even when the OAS was held up as an important actor in promoting democracy in the early and mid 1990s, I was skeptical that it meant very much. The only exception to this, I think, and it was a pretty important exception, was the European Union in from the mid 1970s until the early 2000s, where its really active and robust conditionality played a major role, first in Southern Europe and then in Central Europe. But so even during the good times, the 1990s, early 2000s, international institutions, I think, played a really secondary or tertiary role in promoting democracy. It was Western powers. It was the United States and to some extent European countries that promoted democracy, not international agencies. And I think that the international institutions have weakened considerably since then. The OAS is almost non-existent in terms of democratic democracy promotion since the rise of the sort of Bolivarian axis. And I really, and the, the Trump administration has unfortunately pulled the United States out of any kind of international cooperation in the service of a number of things, whether it's environmental protection, trade, or democracy promotion. So international institutions, in my view, were pretty weak to begin with and are much weaker today. So that's not where I would place my hope.
Professor, we are approaching the end of our conversation here. I just want to let everyone know that we're going to add subtitles later, and this will be on YouTube. I wanted to just go back to one point. So when you look at Bolsonaro's style since he became president, what patterns do you see fitting to your findings in the book, How Democracies Die, there?
And Bolsonaro is an odd figure, and he's actually strangely similar to Trump in a lot of ways. Look, the most obvious thing, the most obvious lesson about Bolsonaro that I think does find echo in the book is that a politician, a candidate who reveals himself or herself to be not committed to democratic rules of the game, to have authoritarian instincts during the campaign, is likely to behave that way in office. It is really important nowadays not to elect candidates who are not committed to democracy. Now, you can't always tell. Viktor Orban had a pretty democratic past and then evolved into an authoritarian. Sometimes leaders hide their authoritarian instincts. Sometimes authoritarian leaders end up governing democratically. Ollanta Humala in Peru might be an example of that. But most of the time, if you elect somebody who has authoritarian instincts, that leader is going to go after democratic institutions. They may not always succeed. Trump has mostly failed so far, and Bolsonaro has largely failed as well. But it is always a threat to elect somebody who's not fully committed to democratic institutions. That's why I think Americans made a big mistake in 2016, and I think Brazilians made a huge mistake in 2018.
And once in office, when these leaders, so one common thing is to think that Bolsonaro's style is much more rhetorical than real, for instance, right? Looking into other cases that you study, is that a common mistake? For instance, just today, the president said, it's coming the hour that everything is going to be put in their right place. That came, this type of rhetoric came after Supreme Court decisions, for instance, right? Is that a mistake to think of that only as rhetorical when you look into the other case that you have studied?
Yeah, we thought a lot about this in writing How Democracies Die, because this was a big topic of discussion in the United States. There were a lot of observers and Trump supporters who said, don't pay attention to the way Trump talks. That's just all talk. He's not going to behave that way in office. And so we looked around at a lot of cases, and we found that anti-democratic or illiberal rhetoric in the campaign or before coming to office usually predicts illiberal and authoritarian behavior in office. That these guys usually do what they say they're going to do. Chavez did what he said he was going to do. Perón did what he said he was going to do. And Bukele in El Salvador is doing what he said he was going to do. And so take these guys seriously.
And that actually leads to a couple of questions we receive here. When you look at different institutions after an election, right? After a figure like that is elected, what institutions are the ones that help to deal with that? Are the courts normally? Are we talking about Congress in a presidential system? Which institutions normally deal with this type of crisis?
I think it varies. There's very often a process of escalating conflict. Many elected autocrats, particularly populists, come to office and they're kind of immediately isolated within, or somewhat isolated within the political system. They don't have a majority in the Congress. They don't have many allies in the Supreme Court. They often don't have too many friends in the media. And so they're kind of politically isolated. So even if they don't have a big authoritarian plan, Alberto Fujimori in Peru did not come to the presidency with a plan to establish an authoritarian regime. They very quickly get into conflict. They can't get stuff through Congress. The Supreme Court keeps knocking them down. The media might be really harsh in criticizing them. And so within a few months or a few years, elected autocrats will, which one it is, I think varies a lot. In Peru, it was mostly it was actually both the court and the Congress. In Brazil, it's obviously varies a lot. And which institution is the one best equipped to respond to it, I think also varies. And often it's not just the institutions. What's really critical is society, that organized society, that interest groups, business, and citizens oppose abuse, and when necessary, mobilize against abuse. And I think, in the United States, for example, the current wave of protests is going to, I think, play a major role in weakening and constraining Trump. The fact that slowly but surely the kind of Sao Paulo establishment, the center-right establishment, has begun defecting from Bolsonaro, I think, does help to provide a check against Bolsonaro. So it's not always the institutions; it's society too.
And do you think people on the streets are an important part on this equation? Because COVID, another thing that it makes it harder is to get, 1 million people on the streets in Paulista, like we saw, right?
That hasn't stopped people in the United States, but you're right. It's made it extremely difficult. It's one of the things I think that helped sort of accelerate Bukele's consolidation of power in El Salvador, when it's illegal for people to leave their homes, and when people are terribly fearful, for good reason, of joining in large groups. That, at least in the short term, really debilitates civil society and limits society's capacity to act collectively against an autocrat. That's one of the many reasons why crises, particularly health crises in this case, create an opportunity to concentrate further power. We've seen this in India, we've seen this in Philippines, but as we've seen in the United States, people sometimes do protest, even in the middle of a pandemic. I think we have not yet seen the public health consequences of those protests, but I wouldn't be shocked to see, I don't know about a similar, but at least some degree of protest in the weeks and months to come in Brazil.
Professor, I want to thank you very much for being here. I know, and I want to let everyone know that you are working on your book, and you took your time to come here and talk to us. Before we finish, I just want to end with another question that we got, and I want to give you a couple of minutes to do your final remarks. The question is very difficult, but I think it's important. Do you think that the institutions will be strong enough in Brazil in face of these anti-democratic movements? How do you feel the role of institutions here in Brazil? Are they strong enough?
Oh God, you're asking me to predict the future?
No.
You know how bad political scientists are?
Yeah.
They're terrible. Economists can't even predict the future, and scientists are worse than economists.
Yeah.
They're terrible.
So I want to give you a couple of minutes just to give out your final remarks. And again, thank you for your time that I know was very difficult to find this hour to talk to us.
I mean, let me just say, I'm not an expert on Brazil, and I'm not an expert on Brazilian institutions, but the strengthening of Brazilian democracy, in spite of the the many, many problems that Brazil faces, extraordinary inequality, the fact that it is a big, heterogeneous, diverse, hard place to govern, the level of violence and criminality. Brazilian political elites face a very difficult challenge. In spite of all those things, the democratic institutionalization, the democratic strengthening of the last, I guess, roughly 30 years has been pretty remarkable. And by, at least by 2014, 2015, Brazil had, it wasn't Uruguay and Costa Rica, but it was one of the strongest democracies in Latin America. And I think so there is some strength, some robustness to Brazilian institutions. The Brazilian Congress is not as easy to push over as the Ecuadorian or Peruvian Congress. The Brazilian Supreme Court is not as easy to intimidate or to pack as, say, the Venezuelan Supreme Court was. That there's a real difference there. And so I cannot predict that Brazilian democracy will survive. I cannot guarantee I cannot guarantee what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. But I think Brazilian institutions do stand a reasonable chance of surviving this crisis and surviving Bolsonaro. It's also worth saying that Brazil has just faced an extraordinary series of crises. I mean, I used to say in 2018 that Brazil, before Bolsonaro was elected, that Brazil was facing a perfect storm. A massive corruption scandal, a massive economic crisis, a terrible wave of violence. And then in addition to that, you get the election of an autocratic leader, a terrible global pandemic, and one of the world's worst responses to that pandemic. I mean, what Brazilians have had to suffer in the last 6 years is difficult to fathom. And so I also wouldn't be shocked if Brazilian democracy succumbed to that set of crises. I mean, it's a level of crisis that, frankly, few democracies have survived in history. But I'm still pretty hopeful. And I think there's a reasonable chance that Brazilian democracy will at the very least, muddle through this seemingly endless series of crises.
Professor Stephen Levitsky, again, thank you very much. I'll just end here with a Portuguese. Então, a todos, nós vamos colocar as legendas em breve e subir no YouTube. E esse é o nosso novo projeto para discutir a democracia brasileira. Agradeço a todos. Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks, Fernando. It was a great pleasure. It was an honor to be here.
Bye-bye.
A MOL quer contribuir com a justiça nesse momento tão difícil. É a hora de buscarmos diálogo, união, soluções conjuntas. É a hora de celebrarmos acordos. Estamos disponibilizando gratuitamente nossa plataforma a todos os órgãos do Poder Judiciário durante a pandemia da Covid-19, para que as conciliações e mediações no Brasil não parem. MOL, online, humana, brasileira.